Every now and then, it's good to reflect on how much things have changed over the last 50 to 100 years, especially if you were around to see some of that for yourself. Now, I obviously wasn't around 100 years ago, but in 1926, a lot of people still owned horses as a primary means of transportation, and the Model T Ford was the main car you'd see on the roads because Ford had made around 14 million of them. Radios were really starting to catch on as many prominent commercial radio stations have begun broadcasting around the country, and around 20% of homes had by that point purchased a radio. And these weren't the tiny little handheld devices we have today, but big appliance-like vacuum tube devices encased in solid wood cabinets that would sit in the living room so everyone could listen. 1926 was the year of the first transatlantic telephone call from London to New York. Now, believe it or not, 1927 was the year of the first video phone call from Washington, D.C. to New York City. But the technology obviously wasn't anywhere near ready for common use, despite all the hopes that it would one day be the norm. Even today, video phones over a phone line aren't a viable consumer product, and we instead use a completely different method of video conferencing through the internet. People 100 years ago did like to order things for home delivery, much like we do today, but the entire experience of ordering was quite different. In its 1926 catalog, Sears Roebuck claimed it was the world's largest store and promised 99 out of 100 orders would be shipped within 24 hours. The country was broken up into 6 service areas and supported with a large network of retail stores and warehouses. And beyond the detailed instructions for measuring sizes for all sorts of clothing, from hats and caps all the way down to hosiery and underwear, the order form included a lot of personal information like your occupation, your earnings, the size of your farm if you had one, your age, your marital status, and any former addresses, and a request for 2 businessmen who could serve as references if you couldn't provide a letter from your banker establishing your credit worthiness. Opposite that page is a note that if you happen to trap animals and need to sell your furs, Sears Roebuck will give you the highest prices in the Chicago fur market as a complimentary service to their valued customers. I absolutely love reading through catalogs like this one and seeing how marketing used to work and what consumer needs used to be. But I also really enjoy thinking about how much marketing has evolved and how, in just a few generations, all of the rules have been written and rewritten over and over again as the very idea of what marketing is has changed from telling people why you should buy their products to creating value through mutually beneficial relationships. So you know what? Let's take a look at how things have changed over time and what we can learn from it. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this is the Marketing Gateway. When you read about the history of marketing and advertising, a lot of the really exciting movements come from the post-war era of the 1940s and 50s in the United States, when an economy that spent a decade in a depression in the 1930s was stimulated by the New Deal and the wartime economic boom in manufacturing and GI Bill benefits. And suddenly, it seemed like the dreams of many Americans to own their own home and have a family car and refrigerator and a television set and all the other niceties of modern living were able to come true. Now, my own grandparents, who grew up in the Depression and saw what it was like to be poor and to not have much, have told me about how miraculous and fast-moving this time period was. People went from being fairly poor to fairly prosperous in a very short amount of time, and the job market was so hot that many employers provided on-the-job training to anyone who was roughly fit for what they were looking for. And those who'd received some sort of vocational training through military service, which was a pretty good chunk of the population after 2 world wars, by the way, didn't need a college education to be able to do a lot of the work available. Neither of my grandfathers had 4-year degrees, but both of them were able to find good paying jobs and afford their own homes. And my grandmothers occasionally worked as well to bring in some extra income. They weren't wealthy, but they were able to provide well for their families and had no problem retiring when they were ready to. Things that would have been out of reach for them growing up, like owning multiple vehicles or buying land or traveling around the world, were things they could easily afford later in life. Now, that didn't mean that they weren't cheapskates sometimes. Growing up poor made them pretty price conscious and frugal with their money. But it did mean that they were always on the lookout for a deal and tended to be willing to go without the latest and greatest things rather than to feel the need to purchase upgrades to all of their household items. They expected to get decades out of major purchases like appliances, furniture, cars, and so forth. And when things broke, they expected them to be fixable rather than replaceable. One thing my grandparents all tended to be was very well conditioned to do preventative car maintenance, probably because that was so essential back in the days when they first bought their first cars. And they also tended to keep a lot of things they bought in hopes that they might find a use for those items one day. Of my grandparents, only one of them is still alive, and she's still very much wired this way today. As long as the things she has are meeting her needs, she really has no desire to upgrade them or to improve them. Although, she's always been funny about wanting to have a really nice car, and she still does, and she takes it to the shop regularly to make sure it's always running well. But the thing that she struggles the most with is her home electronics, because they tend to get outdated so quickly that they need to be replaced. Whenever her smartphone or her iPad or computer go down, she doesn't know what to do because she's not wired to have to replace things that feel like a major purchase to her. So she usually has to have a relative come and help her purchase and set up these new devices. Well, to my grandparents, there were several things that were essential to sustain their lifestyles. There were their homes, their kitchens, their cars, their clothes, and of course, their health and beauty care products. Marketers who wanted to reach them really needed to focus on those 5 topics, and it really wasn't until retirement age that they ever started thinking more aspirationally about what they wanted out of their lives. One set of grandparents was fairly blue-collar and had a hard work mentality, but they also didn't mind spending their extra money on fun things like doing water sports or building go-karts or buying hobby gear. One of their most prized investments was their screened-in porch, where they'd often sit for hours each day, avoiding the Florida mosquitoes while they enjoyed the fresh air as they chatted with visitors or read. The other set were in the military and had more of a white-collar mindset that motivated them to think about owning their dream home, purchasing undeveloped land, and also supporting the mission of their local church. Even so, they would drive an hour and a half out of their way to go shop at the closest military base so they could get the best prices, and they had multiple refrigerators and freezers so they could buy in bulk. For entertainment, both sets of grandparents relied primarily on radio and television. Any other information they consumed generally came from newspapers or magazines, and to a lesser degree, books. One of my grandmothers was an avid reader of Harlequin romance novels, and the other mostly stuck to her Bible. Devices capable of receiving broadcast media were a larger overall investment, but yielded amazing dividends because they could provide free over-the-air entertainment for decades. By the way, neither of my sets of grandparents had satellite or cable service until the 1990s when they were retired, though both sets of grandparents were really happy to eventually have on-demand weather channels, so they didn't have to listen to their weather radios anymore. Print media, while costly over time, were inexpensive ways to get daily, weekly, or monthly information, and it could either be delivered or conveniently purchased. It was pretty common to see large stacks of old newspapers, magazines, and catalogs lying around, waiting to be read or disposed of, and it was also very common for my grandmothers to clip coupons and use them. So, if marketers wanted to reach my grandparents, there were a few options, mainly through what we today call traditional media. Broadcast was of course high value because the message could be transmitted regionally or nationally for a fairly low level of effort. The appeal of broadcast to marketers of the time was both its engaging quality and its higher level of credibility. Print media were next. There were distribution networks that ensured things like newspapers, magazines, and catalogs reached most homes. Magazines were a particularly popular place to take out full-page prestige ads since magazines were often glossy and full color, and many of the most famous ads of the 1960s and 70s come from those sources. Magazines also allowed marketers to reach a target market a little more capably than a general mass media campaign because subscribers tended to have particular traits that could be easily identified to advertisers. But a lot of what you'd see advertised during the earlier days in local newspapers were products or retailers or financial services with far less representation from restaurants, services, or events. Outdoor media were definitely around and offered a way to showcase larger-than-life products and messages towards local motorists, but they were also potentially comparatively expensive and required fairly simple messages to be understandable and visible. Spokesmen and celebrity marketing were a big part of marketing to my grandparents' generation, in part because that's how a lot of product marketing was done in the early broadcast days. We have that today somewhat in affiliate marketing and sponsored content. We have celebrities, influencers, and podcasters that are all still hawking products, right? But the influence of these individuals today is far less credible than the mass market, and the campaigns are much more targeted as a result. Door-to-door selling and personal selling were also a much bigger deal to consumers in my grandparents' era than they are today. Both are still around. I see door-to-door salespeople in my neighborhood regularly during the warmer months, but today's consumers are far more DIY and tend to want to evaluate and inquire about service, not have it brought to them. And of course, many of the tools of making a business visible, signage, retail space, promotional items, brand logos, sales representatives, and so forth, were also commonly used tools for marketers. All of those things are, of course, still around today, but let's talk about a few things that aren't. Phone books were a big deal even 20 or 30 years ago, and a far more reliable source of information about local businesses. And since they were distributed freely to residences and businesses, they were a desirable way of promoting services and restaurants. They're largely vanished from existence today, and we've never really been able to replace them with anything viable on the internet. There's been websites that have tried, of course, but search engines, review sites, and referral networks have largely replaced phone books in general. Another common tool marketers employed was stunt marketing, often as a way of getting earned media through local press and broadcast sources. This could involve attempting to grab attention through special community appearances, like having the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile come to town, or the really strange things marketers used to do, like when Richard Branson's Virgin Cola thought it'd be a good idea to have him drive a tank through Times Square and run over 3 tons of Coca-Cola cans and then make it look like he was firing a cannon to shoot the Coca-Cola sign. Did I mention that Coca-Cola didn't take kindly to the stunt and drove Virgin Cola out of business in the US market after that? You still occasionally see these strategies employed, but not nearly the way they used to be. Today's focus is instead on the much less risky and more cost-effective viral marketing sort of strategy that leverages social media to try to get ideas or topics trending. Another thing that marketers really stay away from today, and I think this is a big positive, is advertising that may be perceived as sexist, racist, or misogynistic. Even up to the 80s and 90s, I can remember quite a few ads, products, and marketing campaigns that were quite offensive by today's standards, and I don't want to suggest that this has ever completely stopped. There are plenty of modern examples where advertisers have really stepped in it with concepts that they should have tested with a more discriminating audience. My grandparents had very little sensitivity to this, of course. They were used to seeing women belittled and products targeted squarely towards certain ethnic groups, so it didn't bother them nearly as much as it bothered their children or their grandchildren. But, in a world where we no longer have Aunt Jemima or Uncle Ben or Mia, the Native American butter maiden from Land O'Lakes butter, adorning our packaging, and where women are not being singled out as needing products that are daintier or which will help them get a man, I think we're all better off. All of this is to say, times change and our strategies for reaching people with our marketing change with them. While it's always fun to look at what used to work and to think about how we can learn from the days gone by, it's also interesting to think about that what works today for my generation might not work on my own kids or grandkids when they're my age. And you know what? I can't wait to see what that world looks like. I'm Sean in St. Louis, and this has been the Marketing Gateway. See you next time. So our plug this month is for animal welfare and rescue. And I'm not going to mention any one particular organization as a place that I want you to designate your attention because there are so many that are in need. And whether you have a local animal shelter or humane society or a place that's doing trap and release or anything along those lines, there's always a need to donate to help support the care and rehabilitation of animals in your area. One group that I do like to donate to is Stray Rescue of St. Louis. They are very well regarded in terms of their reputation. They have a 90% score on Charity Navigator, and they do a great job of getting to know the animals within, especially the urban areas, that have been abused or neglected or just set loose, have gotten loose from careless owners or things like that. And they help these animals to begin to trust humans again and to find forever homes. And I respect and admire their mission so much. But there are many other animal groups out there as well that are looking after and caring for animals that have been discarded. Now, I want to say, I'm an animal lover, and there are many cats and dogs and other adoptable pets out there that people get with great intentions. When they're puppies or kittens, they're cute, right? They're fun to have, but they can't care for them properly. And instead of trying to find a good forever home for these pets, they'll go out and they'll drop them off in the woods, or they'll, just kind of let them go loose in their neighborhood or things like that. And this almost always is one of the worst things you can do for these animals, because they wind up coming back to where humans are living because they're dependent on humans for food. Um, they get in fights with other pets. They get in fights with wildlife. They get hit by cars. A lot of bad things can happen. And the people that are out there watching for these animals, caring for them, having compassion for them, are people that I respect and admire like you wouldn't believe. So again, I want you to take some time, research your local animal welfare organizations in your area, and be sure to give, because especially during the summer, these animals are threatened like you wouldn't believe by the heat and by just all the additional activity that's going on. And so anything you can do to help will make sure that these animals get another chance at a great life.